All right, well, that was all on purpose. I needed to find out who is really interested by making it really hard to stay here. So I'm super grateful. I mean, the amount of people, I'm really surprised for the last session here, honestly. But I'm really glad that there are so many people around still, especially after this artificial test of your patience. But even without that, yeah, I suppose you have all read the descriptions and stuff by now, so you know I'm Andreas. I haven't had a chance yet, but really brief, who are you guys? SQL DBAs, hands up. Almost everybody, I think, or everybody, really, yeah. Okay, any devs, like double roles, I suppose, right? Yeah, okay. Somebody would call himself security admin. Yep, okay, architect, you also design your systems. Yep, okay. Somebody from the BI world. Okay, meaning you have like 3 or 4 hats on. Okay. Okie dokie. All right, so before we get into the individual topics that I prepared, I hope the audio is good. I hear a little bit echo. Is that all right for you guys? Yeah, okay, good. Why are we doing all of this, what I'm about to show you? Why bother working with, under these principles? So there's 2 things I would like for us to keep in mind. Probably some of you have heard, if you've seen DBA, assume breach is like this mindset that we have also at Microsoft to always design the systems and having in mind, well, it could eventually get broken into, right? Not because I'm doing something bad, but things evolved. There are 0 days attacks. There are things I can't control all the time. We need to assume something can happen, and we need to prepare ourselves for that moment and not just blindly rely on our controls and say, oh, done, I have put in place encryption here and access control there and stuff, and now I'm done. No, no. You need to go further, right? Which is why, for example, you have auditing, right? If you would trust your system 100%, why would you bother auditing, right? No, you audit for the case that somebody did something that you didn't really want him to, right? However level that was. Maybe it was just a glitch, or maybe it was an actual real attack, right? So this mindset of assume breach makes you use auditing, for example. And the other thing that it makes you use is the principle of least privilege, or to implement the principle of least privilege by really just applying the minimal permissions that you possibly can apply, right? And now there you are depending on us, Microsoft, right? What permissions do we offer you, right? Obviously. But from these permissions, you pick the lowest one that just allows that person to make its job, right? So in the background here is not just blindly trust our controls, but in the case something gets abused, that we limit the blast radius, right? That, okay, somebody got access to a certain account, well, at least it's not the sysadmin running the web application. At least it's hopefully just able to run select, insert, update, delete on user tables, but not take on the whole system, right? So that's where you start limiting to really need to find out what is the minimum permission versus what does the application actually need to do in your database, right? And typically an application shouldn't have to create logins on new databases. It works inside a database, and now it depends what it does, but usually working with tables, procedures, right? And that might be the end of it. And sometimes it might be more fancy, but normally you don't have a reason to grant DB owner or sysadmin, something like that, right? And you will be surprised how often I still see that, right? You probably have seen it once in a while, right? So these are the 2 mindsets we would like to keep in mind. Now in this session, I have these topics prepared here. I'm talking about delegation, about principle of least privilege, some special behavior with ownership chaining, and managing access at scale using Microsoft Purview. Now, since the demos cannot work on this purely PowerPoint machine, I'm going to walk you through it. Hopefully, we can still make sense of what I'm going to talk about. So, delegation is the concept of basically you don't want to have to do everything, right? You may be the DBA. You have obviously the permissions to create users and grant permissions to those users, create logins, assign role memberships, etc. But at some point, you will probably realize that you don't need to take care of all these permissions ideally. You want to delegate it to somebody else, maybe in certain databases and in certain parts of a database, because it just keeps changing there who needs which permission on that in a certain area, but it's not on a level where you always need to be involved, right? You will probably still need to create the users, but to actually change the permissions in certain systems, wouldn't it be great if you can leave it to somebody trustworthy, of course, that takes care of such things, right? Probably not, you're not going. So what you not want to do is like grant the sysadmin privileges to that other person, right? That's not really the best thing to do. Ideally, you're not even using it yourself all the time, right? But what you really want to do is to delegate that other person a small set of permissible permissions. So for example, I have a database here for web shop, or no, let's say no, for HR, and my junior admin should be able to allow other people to read the tables there, maybe to insert the tables, right? But certainly not create new users and so on, right? Really just work with the data. He can, if there's a new employee coming or a new trainee, he should be able to take care of allowing them to read the tables. Nothing more fancy than that, right? Now, unfortunately, in our permission system today, we do not have a permission to grant a permission, right? You know the statement grant, right? But in order to run the statement grant X permission, you need to be security admin or DB owner, right? But there is not a I grant, you grant statement, right? The grant statement cannot be granted, right? So since we don't have that, yeah, there are two possible methodologies that I'm going to talk about. And the first one is going to be how to use roles for delegating permissions. So yeah, you certainly know roles, that roles have permissions on the end objects, right? And if you're a member of the role, that's fine, then you have whatever that role has. But what I mean here is how you delegate permission management through roles. So the idea is here, while we do not have a grant statement, I cannot grant you to use the word grant, I do have the ability in T-SQL to allow you to change role membership on a specific role. All right? So I can say, I grant you author role on my HR table reader role, whatever name it is. All right? So, and if you have that ability now, then you can add other members to that role. All right? And that's in essence what I'm after here, to delegate the role membership management to another person. Now, the key, of course, is what can that role do, right? So in my scenario, maybe that role is just exactly for that scenario where the trainees can read table data and maybe insert on a certain schema, right? So the permissions that role has, they are fixed, right? Once I create the role and assign the permissions, grant the permissions, if I then further allow management of role memberships, that means that person that I grant this management to cannot change the permissions, right? It has to take the role as it is, right? So if at some point it realizes, well, I only want this trainee to do select, but the role can do select and insert, well, then I need to have a different role, right? Because he cannot further filter or change the role permissions. That's because he doesn't have permission. He only has permission to change memberships and roles and nothing else. So I have a fancy graphic here. I think actually the graphic is probably more complicated than the role, than the code. But in essence, basically me as the admin in red here, I create a role, grant permissions to that role, and then later on in the bottom part, I'm granting access and granting the author role permission to another person that can then invite other people to that same role. So that's the essence. I'm going to show the T-SQL code for that as well, just to make sure this makes sense. I cannot run it, though. Then that's the limit, right? Yeah. What do you like? Do you want to have WordPad or Notepad? What do you think? Hello. Okay. I think Notepad is cool. I'm going to increase the font, I think. Oh, it went away. When did I lose the screen here? What happened? Oh. It's all the same in front of me. Now I'm back in PowerPoint. Okay, PowerPoint is working. Okay, so it's some, I see. Okay, so how do I get that over? I cannot. I think I will need a trick here. And that on a Lenovo tablet with a different keyboard. Okay, so let me see if I can trick. I'm still preparing something here to put it on the slide, where you then can hopefully read it. No, I will need to limit this here. Okay. Yeah, I will need to keep it very limited here, what I can show. So this is basically the essence. So in this case, Alejandra, who is mentioned on the bottom, right, that is the delegate, right, the person that I'm allowing to invite other people to that role. So that role has some permissions, and I want Alejandra to basically grant these permissions to other people. Well, I do it using that role, right? That's really as simple as it is, not really complicated, right? I have created the role beforehand. I ran some grant select statements on that role. I believe you know how that looks, right? If not, I mean, feel free to ask. I'll copy that over. Yeah, but that's basically it, right? And after that, Alejandra can log in and herself can say can say alter role, add member, and then can add other members, right? With that statement, she has the permissions to do that. She just can't change the permissions of that role. That would still be up to me, right? So I would say it's actually a pretty simple system to use roles. However, of course, it does have some limitations. Again, the permissions are fixed, and if I want to delegate multiple variations of permissions, well, I'm going to end up with many roles, right? So yeah, that's as good as it gets, right? If I want to delegate, I really may have to create many roles. Now, there is another way in SQL. I don't know how many have heard of that one, is grant with grant option. Anybody has used that? Really used or just heard of it? Okay, yeah. All right, yeah, this is certainly not something I would recommend for everybody, but just to have spoken about it. So the grant with grant option, so when you grant a permission, any permission, you can always say with grant option. So you grant permission, let's say I grant select on table XYZ to John with grant option. Now John himself can again use the same statement. He can use grant select on that table to any other person. Right? He is limited to use the exact same syntax, the same permission that I have used with this grant statement, right? With grant option statement. So he can keep granting. However, he has to, and that's something to be careful, he has to also use the with grant option if he does it. Otherwise, SQL Server does not recognize it, that it's really his identity that is running the grant statement. Because behind the scenes, SQL Server will persist in metadata that this time John was granting the permission and not like the DBO himself. Typically, if you look into sys permissions, the DMV, the catalog view, you will see a grantor ID. Right? The grantor is the person who grants it to the grantee. Right? So in this syntax here, I am running the statement, I'm the grantor, probably my ID is 0 as a DBO, right? And the grantee is whoever role ID that sensor data manager or principal ID that has. Right? This is the grantee, but the grantor is me. But when I use the with grant option, and now I am the other person who has been granted with grant option, that ID will be persisted in metadata. And that's where it starts to get complicated when you want to remove these permissions again, because then you need to remember who actually was the person granted it. So if John granted James, I cannot, as a DBO, just say revoke James. No, because it was John who granted James. I need to say revoke from James as John. Basically, I have to assume for this very command that I want to remove the metadata row that was assigned to John. John was the grantor, right? That's where it gets tricky. The worst thing, you don't get an error message. It just says, OK. If you run a revoke statement for a permission that doesn't exist, you don't get an error. You probably have noticed, right? You can repeat that as many times as one, no error. Right? Always make sure, is it really revoked? Yeah. Why not run it the second time? Nothing can happen, right? But in this case, it's the same thing. So if you forget the as statement, it will remain there, the old row with the permission, because it's persisted that it has been run by a different person and not yourself. So that's why it's a bit tricky to use that, because you cannot even drop John in my example before you haven't removed any permission that guy has granted to others, because he is persisted. Just like if you think of ownership of tables, if somebody owns a table in a database, you cannot drop that user because he still is an owner of some objects. You get an error message, right? In this case, you would get an error message telling that user still has granted permissions in a database. It's not something that your junior DBA wants to deal with to find out where is that now. What is that even, right? Yeah, so yes, it exists, but be really careful and document very well what you're doing. Otherwise, you're going to have really a mess of permissions in your system. You can have double, triple entries, right? If different people grant the same permission to the same person, well, you have those multiple permission grants, and you need to remove each of them with the exact correct principal ID. Not as DBO, right? Okay, I hope that is enough of a warning. Okay.
If I were to, say, put sensor data manager in DB deny get a reader, would they still be able to grant select even though they can't now select?
If you put sensor data manager.
In your select?
Yeah.
So if I were to deny sensor data manager select on the schema.
On this schema, yeah.
Can they still grant, even though they can't read?
No, because they are only able to run the command that I here granted with grant option. And since you use the deny, they cannot. Actually, it's a good. Yeah, can you deny with deny? That I don't know. I would have to test. All right. So basically, the question is, can I run a deny select on whatever to somebody with grant option, and can that person deny? I can't remember, honestly. I would have to test. I can't do that in PowerPoint or so. Yeah. It is tricky. I have rarely seen it, but it's interesting. I had like 2 or 3 people who said they actually used that. Yeah. Is it still in production, or is it more like a test that you did?
Pretty rare. I've used it before.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. So it exists, but it's to handle with care. So now those are the 2 options, right? As you can see, all of them have some downsides. This is really tricky to handle. The other one is very limited in what it can do, right? But these are really all the options that you have in T-SQL to delegate. Otherwise, you have to grant to make the people member of security admin or even DB owner, right? Which is something you want to limit. All right, yeah. So we just talked about that. Okay, let's get at another example. Principle of least privilege by using impersonation. So scenario, you want to, again, delegate something to somebody, but in this case, it's a bit different. You want to allow a junior DB or something to view metadata about a database, metadata that is actually server-level data. There are certain DMVs that you have a server level that show you metadata about database performance. They show you, in fact, metadata from all databases, right? But you can filter them by database, right? So sysdm actually request would be one example, right? And many other DMVs, right? But they are really server-level DMVs. Now, if you want to allow your junior DBA to only analyze executing requests or wait stats from a certain database, you need to somehow force him to run the select star from system exec request with the where clause of his database, right? Not so easy to convince him to do that, right? If he forgets it, he will just see data from other databases. Furthermore, if you allow him to run that DMV, what is the permission that you have for a DMV? It's written there, actually, right? Just testing. It's the view server performance state permission, which is actually kind of new. It used to be view server state. I don't know if you noticed over the last year, I introduced a bunch of more granular permissions on DMVs. That's one, right? So, but still, this one still permits you to see approximately 600 other DMVs that you may not want to expose to him, right? This is the least available permission that we offer you. So now it's not your fault that we don't have a least privilege, right? That's one of these scenarios where there is just not more deeper granularity. On the other hand, I believe you don't want to have a permission per DMV, right? Who would want that? Not really many people here in the audience, zero. Yeah, so, but sometimes you need to solve such scenarios, right? So the solution in these cases could be that you create custom code, basically a stored procedure that runs the statement that you want to allow, like select star from system exec requests, where DB ID is current database or something like that, right? To just give it for that database where that person actually is allowed to work and nothing else. You store that, you save that stored procedure in metadata, and then allow that person to execute just that stored procedure and nothing else, right?
That stored procedure have to execute as inside of it?
So the way I'm doing this one here will be, now the challenge is here that this stored procedure will be residing in a user database, in that user database where my junior DBA is allowed to work, right? But it's actually retrieving data from the server scope. And in these cases, you need some special treatment to allow that procedure to to run inside a database and get data from outside, right? So some people, I sometimes see in the internet, they use the trustworthy on option, right? It's allow trustworthy on a database. Please don't, just forget about that, right? That's the dirty method, just works, yeah? But it basically means that the server trusts any code that comes from the database. If you take that statement apart, it's not really a good statement, right? So don't do that, right? The proper solution, unfortunately, of course, takes a bit more work, is you create a certificate that you save at the server level on the master database, that's the server level, and that same certificate has to reside in that user database, and it will be used to sign that stored procedure. And then the server scope, my server trusts that certificate. It will be sent from that stored procedure, which is signed by that certificate. Server detects that and then can allow exactly that code to run because it trusts that certificate, right? The stored procedure being signed with that certificate will be trusted and can run these statements.
So also never use the execute as?
Oh no, execute as works in scenarios, but in this case, let me think, how would it go? You would have to have a login with, in this case, you can't use the execute as login in the store procedure because you're mixing database scope and the server scope. Otherwise, no issues with the execute as statements per se. It's just a different, I mean, it does the same. It executes as a certificate user, but it doesn't use the execute as statement. It does it by being signed. Now the question is, can I show that code somehow? So what the gentleman here was asking is about impersonation using execute as, right? There's either ad hoc, you can say execute as somebody, and then you can run some tests, right? What would happen if I would be that person? Do I have the right permission? Well, it's definitely useful for testing. Or you can actually save stored procedures and have them execute as a certain account, which is also is the same background, right? You want to have a temporary, or like for the runtime of the stored procedure, you want to change the permissions, right? By switching into a different identity that has more or even less permissions. Kind of like the run as statement in Windows. You do it for a certain necessity, so you don't have to grant the executor of the procedure or these other permissions that it may need, right? You don't want to, right? You hide it in the code, and the code runs under elevated permissions, right? That you can do, but in this case, I am signing, or I would sign a stored procedure with a certificate. Now let me try if I can somehow squeeze that here on the PowerPoint. It's a bit tricky here with two screens. Here. I'm going to copy over the most important pieces of that solution here in a slide. And you will get the slides, but also the demo code, I believe. Then you have it all. Come on, Control V. Okay. So that would be 1 bit. So what I'm excluding lots of things, right? I'm not showing the user or the store procedure. This is just a standard store procedure. There's nothing special about the store procedure. It has just the code that you wanted to execute. The interesting pieces are how to get to the signature, right? You first prepare the certificate on the master database, and then create a login based on that, which is necessary so you can grant a permission. You can't grant permissions to certificates, but you can grant permissions to logins. And the login is based on the certificate, right? That's why I have these 2 lines here, basically, these 2 objects. So, next one. Yeah, that's just a simple grant that permission, and I'm using the login, not the certificate, right? So now the login-based, certificate-based login has the permission. Now what I cannot show, it's a bit lengthy code, but basically I have to recreate the exact same certificate in the user database, and I do that by copying the binary. You can look at the binary with a select, you create a dynamic T-SQL statement, and do again a create certificate statement in the user database from binary that you pulled with your dynamic T-SQL. It's a bit too long to show on a slide, but that's in a nutshell what it is, and you would see it when you get the code, right? So you recreate the same certificate. We don't have a copy certificate statement, right? But we have a create from binary statement, and that's how you create this exact same certificate in your user database. So, and once you have done that, the important piece will be to sign the stored procedure. With that statement. So you have a certificate, now you're in the user database as third server monitoring terms, that's the certificate. And I'm adding a signature to my procedure that happens to have the name monitoring DM exec request stat, right? So you can kind of guess what's inside. There's nothing special. If you know how to write a DMV query, that's what it is, right? There's nothing special. This is the special piece, right? The signature itself, added to the store procedure. If I now look at metadata, I will see that sys.procedures, I would see it has been signed with that certificate that I just prepared, right? And that's basically it. I'm done, because the certificate will now be detected in the moment that I run the store procedure. When I execute it, the server will recognize, hey, the store procedure has that certificate signature on its back somehow, right? And it's matched to a login, and the login has the permissions to actually view the data from DMX query stats, right? Because I gave that login that big permission. But the user only has permission to execute exactly that statement, that procedure, right? So that's how I'm hiding that, right? Yeah.
I've done this a lot, working with TDD and asymmetric keys and stuff.
Yeah.
Right, procedures to do that. When I signed it, I've never used with password. I was wondering the purpose of that.
Oh, for, demo laziness. So, yeah. Yeah, I mean, here for my purpose it works, right? Obviously, the password needs to be kept secret. But I'm code signing here. What do you have expected?
Yeah, it was code signing because I had a low priv account that was creating asymmetric.
You're using a private key there.
Certificate, created a login from the certificate.
Yeah.
Copied the certificate with cert bytes and cert private bytes in
Yeah.
the user database.
Yeah.
Created a user from that, and then signed the certificate, and then signed the stored procedure with the certificate.
Yeah.
But never with password.
Okay. Yeah.
The question is the with password.
Yeah, why did I? Yeah, no specific strong reason here. No, this wasn't even the focus of that one. You're right. Yeah. No. Yeah, the certificate has been created with password, not really nicely. Yeah, exactly. I was lazy here. It's for demo purposes, exactly. Yeah. The interesting thing is when you do this with act signatures, what's obviously important that nobody can just change the proc and suddenly can do more that you wanted it, right? I mean, the junior DBA maybe has author proc permission. Yeah, you may have. But if he actually changes that store procedure, the signature is gone, right? Automatic tamper detection, sort of, right? Basically, signature is gone. If he tries to execute it again with his malicious code, yeah, no, sorry, Paul, that procedure is not trusted on the server level, right? Only if it has that certificate signature, and of course for that you need a special permission, right? To add the signature, you need to have the, I think it's author permission on the certificate, right? To use that certificate for signing purposes. So you cannot just easily abuse that, right? Yeah. Okay, yeah, so the typical use cases for using these certificate-based authentication, authentication can also do, in fact, you can use it for authenticating from one database to another. That is actually possible. In general, this scenario is here accessing system metadata from a database, sometimes for dynamic SQL. Overall, the background is lack of granular permissions, so you need to kind of create it by having a module that runs that exact statement. Sometimes also used for DBCC commands, where we have still a bunch of DBCC commands that require sysadmin, but you want to allow somebody to run DBCC, checkDB or something, right? Then you create a proc for him, and that proc is allowed, but not the DBCC command itself, right? Things like that can be solved with the same modular approach that I just here kind of demonstrated. Yeah. All right. Okay. Yeah, so this is one of the manual solutions where when our permission system is too coarse-grained, right? It is a lot of work, but it is solvable, right? So many database systems I see ending up with something like an administrator or maintenance database that has a bunch, like maybe 2 dozen, 3 dozen store procedures that pull out certain data for exactly that purpose. The query behind would require higher privileges, but I have captured them inside the store procedure with the proper filtering and only allow these store procedures and not all 600 DMVs or sysadmin in general for DBCC commands, right? So that's a quite typical approach you see in larger enterprise where you want to enable junior admins to run just specific statements which normally are only allowed by sysadmin, DB owner, etc. Right? Yeah.
Is there a way to use either signing or an execute as or something like that on a view?
No, views cannot be signed or anything like that. No. Only modules. Modules would be triggers and store procedures. I haven't tested functions. Multi-valued, table-valued functions might be possible. I haven't tried. I don't know from top of my head, but yeah, typically it's triggers or procedures. Yeah. Yep. All right. Okay, ownership chaining. Who in the room knows ownership chaining? And what happens with that? Really not? No, come on. You already knew almost everything about what I just showed. I'm sure you know about ownership chaining. Let's see. So in SQL Server, and I have some very wordy slides, but I never ever expect the audience to read, right? But I think that the information is valuable later at home, whatever. I don't bother reading that, right? I'm talking about anything that's super important right now. The text is for at home. So ownership chaining is basically a special functionality or behavior in SQL Server. The name is a bit of misleading. Ownership chaining is like the cause, but what it really, the effect is, that's what people usually refer to as ownership chaining. So with ownership chaining, you basically can save a lot of permission granting. Like you're probably used to grant permissions on store procedures, right? Grant execute on store procedure, or maybe on views. but you don't have to grant the permission on the table underneath the store procedure, right? Whatever the store procedure is doing with the table, insert or update or select, right? You probably have realized that, right? You just grant the store procedure and it just seems to work, right? And that is because of that concept of ownership chaining, right? So it's kind of, we're just used to that, and you may not know the name for that concept, but this is actually a very special concept of SQL Server coming from Sybase. Other databases don't have that behavior, right? But it saves you a lot of permissions, right? Otherwise, if you create a store procedure that inserts into one table, normally, let's say in Oracle, you would have to grant execute on store procedure and grant insert on the table to that person. You're probably like, oh, God, that's exactly not what I wanted. Why did I create a store procedure? To not have him circumvent it and go to the table. Yeah, but that would be the behavior in other databases, right? I think they have some ways to mitigate that meanwhile. But in general, in SQL Server, it just is not necessary. And why is it not necessary? That's because of ownership chaining. And what is that? That is hidden in the metadata that I show here on that slide. So on this slide, I'm showing one database with on the bottom one table and two views and one store procedure on top. I have put here the object name. The object name is schema and object name, right? Two-part name. And I have put an owner. That's the important piece, right? So my store procedure's name is access dot. That's the schema name, access. And then the object name is returns by date, right? And the owner of that procedure is access. Yeah, it's a strange name. It doesn't really matter. It's a database principle, right? By that name, right? That identity owns that object, right? And then we see other objects in different schema. The schema in the next one is app dot, right? App. And then the object name is sales 2021 returned, right? And the owner is a different name, right? Schema owner app1. And then again, the next view, different name of the view, owner is the same. That's kind of important, right? And then on the bottom, we see again a different name of the table, just sales, right? That contains all the raw data, owned by the DBO, okay? So now the question is, how many grant statements do I need to enable Shakti to run the store procedure successfully? I'll give you 20 seconds.
Execute on the procedure.
Okay, what else? Oh, that was the answer? Hands up with fingers. Give me some fingers, how many grant statements? Anything between 0 and 10. You can believe me, 2 hands are enough. 2 fingers, so 1 finger means 1 permission, yeah? Okay. So I see 2, that's the highest bit I'm getting, 2, yeah? Okay. All right. So yeah, let's see. Answer is 3. How come? Maybe it's just the lateness. So remember, we need, so ownership chaining functions that way. As long as the owner is the same, you only need to have permission on the outermost object. So let's say you have view calling another view, both owned by the same outermost object means, well, the first view, right? So we have a proc on the outer bound. Obviously, you need execute store procedure. That's a no-brainer, right? Otherwise, you can't even start anything. Now, if that store procedure selects from that view, SQL Server will check, is it the same owner? Is it? Is the view owned by the same? No, it's not, right? Proc and view have different owners. That means the user needs a permission on that next object. So we have 2 now, okay? And of course, a different permission, right? In this case, it's like a select permission or maybe insert, whatever the proc does, right? So now 1 down, SQL Server sees another view being mentioned, and the owner is the same, right? Now ownership chaining, the chain is intact. And because the chain is intact, he will not bother asking for the permission. That is the exact reason. As long as the chain is intact, SQL Server will not bother checking permission. In fact, it goes as far, he wouldn't even care if I have a deny there. He just doesn't bother, all right? Even if I deny Shakti, that view in the on the bottom there, the sales 2021, if I deny that, no, he will not even look at it, all right? Doesn't matter. I already granted it to the first view. It's the same owner, all done. I don't care, right? So now it keeps going to the table, right? And the table is, again, a different owner, right? So we had 1, 2. Now comes the third permission, right? Obviously not the greatest design because Shakti can just go to the table and get the raw data, right? But to get the point across, right? That's how ownership chaining works, right? So that's important to keep in mind. And yeah, it is even possible between databases, but that's not so often used, so I will spare you that one. Yeah.
Also with the impression that if you have access to a stored procedure and the person created that stored procedure has all permission in the world, because they made the procedure and had all the access, they sort of said, this stored procedure made you all this stuff, even though you as a user were not.
Yeah. I know why, so the gentleman has the sort of impression or experience that if you create a stored procedure on the chain of objects, that because you had the ability to do that, it's somehow persisted that then the execute is sufficient, right? This is based on experience, and I totally get why you have that impression, right? Because in most environments, all these objects, I mean, do a check in your system, right? Most people still use DBO as owner of objects. And that's why you will never notice these differences. But what really matters is the owner, not the permission of whoever created the procedure. All right? But I totally get where you have that impression because it feels like that. But no, the actual reason is the owner of whatever the chain is in your objects. Yeah. Yeah.
So does it feel like, for example, if you grant permission for yellow, right?
Yellow thing view, yeah.
So let's say this owner has stored procedures. Would it automatically have permission for stored procedures? Or would it do view under this ownership?
So,
My understanding, like,
yeah.
by creating on first view,
Yeah.
you automatically bring it to.
No, okay, no, the behavior is not, so if I say grant Shakti select on the view that is on top there with say is return something, right? If I grant select on that, that is one statement, and this permission will be persisted. It does not mean that there will be a permission automatically granted to the second view, no. What it means is that if Shakti selects from that view and that view selects from another view owned by the same person, and the person is here the schema owner app 1, that that SQL Server will just not even check permissions on the second one because the owner is the same. The background is somehow, well, the owner already gave permission, he owns both things, so he knows what he's doing, and why would he bother to having to grant multiple permissions? We trust the owner that his intent was to really make it run, right? So ignore the second one. It's a performance optimization, of course, because we save permission checks, right? I mean, chains can be very long. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I had a fancy demo. I will go through that manually here, how the demo would have looked like. So in my demo, I'm creating a table. No, sorry, I'm creating two schemas. Let's put them here already. One schema called Shakti and one schema called dev. And I create a dev0 user, and that user has the ability to create views, right? And Shakti has created a table in her schema. Her schema, meaning the schema with that name. Now, what is really important is who owns these schemas. And what in my demo I would have shown you is, if you're not careful as a DB owner who prepares this schema, potentially, right? All of these schemas will be owned by DBO, you, right? And some people feel really good about it because, well, if it's still mine, nothing bad can happen, right? Okay, right? Except that in such a scenario, now I'm giving the dev permissions to create objects in the dev schema. I said grant author table, grant create view on the database, and I said grant author schema on dev0. Right? With these two permissions, he can create schemas in his schema, or in the schema called dev. It's not really his. Right? Now, Shakti has a table in the schema called Shakti, which is actually owned by DBO. Right? Now, the dev the principal dev0 cannot go and run a statement select star from Shakti.table whatever, because I never gave him permission. I gave him create table, create view permission, and author schema on dev, not on Shakti schema, right? But if the developer has the permission to create a view in the schema dev, and also the permission to test his views, so for example, I grant him control on that schema, so he can actually run all of these things, or I may grant him select on his view, on his schema in addition, right? Then what happens? The dev can create a view containing a text like select star from Shakti.table. Now he cannot select from Shakti's table directly, but he can then use that view that he himself has the power to create, and that will return the data from Shakti's table. And the reason there again is ownership chaining, right? Because it's not actually his schema and it's not Shakti's schema, it's just the name and permissions there, but the owner is still BBO on both sides. So he can abuse that if the chains are intact. So the moral of the story is if you want to really hide data from your devs, you cannot give them permissions on DDL permissions in that database or system, whatever scope it is, because they may be able to abuse ownership chaining to just make code for themselves that then can get to the data that they otherwise might not get to, right? It's tricky, but if you understood the concept, it's pretty simple. Once you understood, hey, I know there's a table name, and I cannot read it, but I can create a view for it, and then that's it, right? Okay.
Question.
Yeah.
What permissions are required to do DBR?
Sorry, what?
So in that case,
Yeah.
your dev0,
Yeah.
what would they need to be able to determine that both the schemas were owned by DBO?
What permission do I need to understand the metadata, you mean?
Right.
I see. So where is the metadata that explains you that? You would have to select from sys.tables and sys.views and sys.schemas, right? Sys.schemas tells you who's the schema owner. There's a principal ID, schema owner. Sys.tables and views usually have a null in the principal ID, meaning that object is owned by the schema owner. That's the standard behavior, unless somebody on purpose changed the owner individually on a table. Very nasty. Hopefully not the case, but you need to double check, right? So basically, you just need to understand who is the owner of all these objects, and that means you need to have some permissions on object, right? Because of metadata security. In SQL Server, you can see only objects that you have some permission on. Some. Not necessarily a high one, right? So if you had select permissions on all of these objects and the schemas, you would be able to detect that, right? But otherwise, DB owner, of course, can see that, right? Or even, DDL admin sync. DDL admin should be able as well, because DDL admin can see all objects, and the metadata is complete enough to show you that. Yeah. The principal ID of a table or of a schema tells you who owns it, right? And you will see in your databases, it's very often 1. 1 is the principal ID of the DBO, right? Okay. So this is something I usually recommend developers. Now we are not so full of developers here, but maybe you have a talk with them. Permission management in SQL Server can be fairly easy if you stick to proper schema design, right? So for an example, what is not proper schema design would be AdventureWorks. You still know AdventureWorks? I know, I'm kind of old. Anybody else? Yeah, I know whiteboard is important, so I just updated. So we have in the AdventureWorks, what is so special about this is you have multiple schemas, so it looks nice, nicely organized. But if you look closer, you will realize in all of these schemas, you have a mixture of the views, the tables, and even stored procedures. All of that in the same schema, organized by topic, right? But that means if you want to allow people to select views from human resources and not tables, what do you want to have to do? How do you grant permissions to only read the views and not the tables and only execute procedures? Well, if they're all in the same schema with the tables, you have no choice. You would have to grant each individual view. Or you give up and say, yeah, well, it's just too much work, right? At some point, you're going to have these decisions, right? I mean, it has to be manageable, right? So much better would have been if the designers would have separated the views from the actual raw data, all right? And then it's really easy. You can, so in my example over there, I put store procedures and views in the yellow schemas up there, right, where you have then the ability to just say grant, select, comma, execute on schema web shop. And that's it. That's a statement, two-liner, right, and you're done. If your database is optimized from the schema in that way, by that you have allowed whoever I granted that to read all views and run any store procedure, and these store procedures can access data in any of these other schemas potentially. Depends who the owners are, right? But that's up to you to decide. But you don't need to be careful about mixing tables with store procedure, etc. Right? So ideally, separate the object types, and I separate always by access paths. Right? What do you want the application to actually go to? They run store procedures ideally. Maybe sometimes views, maybe you need them for ETL or business analytics. Right? You create these views, but often you don't want them to see the raw data. Well, separate the objects for accessing the data out from the rest. Right? That would make it easier. And then you really have simple statements. So in general, avoid granting table or object level permissions. It's just getting very, very messy on your system to even analyze. Right? If you have to ever run a query, give me all permissions for a user, right? How much you have to join around. If you can avoid having object permissions, much easier. Right? Okay, so Halloween time, yeah, so right. Yep. Okay, so this is for at home. Don't bother to read that now. All right, I have last topic, managing access at scale using Microsoft Purview. Any questions up to here? All right. So the challenge, especially in Azure, it becomes obvious, but you can also have it in your on-prem environment. How do you manage access to hundreds or thousands of SQL servers and all the databases behind it, right? How do you do it today? Well, I suppose you somehow have to log in, right? Maybe use PowerShell, but in the end, you have to run some T-SQL locally to each database or server, right? Create the logins, create roles, grant permissions. All is done on each individual server and or database, right, depending on the granularity, right? Now the downside is obvious. You have to really connect to the server and it has to be alive, right? If it's not online in that moment, maybe it was just rolled out, right? Then you need to wait a bit and repeat that attempt, right? And you can also not see from a high level who has access to where, right? You have to go through all of them, I suppose, to make sure you didn't miss a login or a permission for that employee that is just leaving you. Fortunately, happens. All right. So those are the downsides. Also, separation of duties. I don't know if it's important for anyone here in the room. Separation of duties, is that something you need to look at? It's rare, right? But the idea behind this is basically that some companies for critical tasks need to ensure that two people are in control. Not a single individual can, for example, create a login or grant sysadmin privileges because it's so high, right? Lower level stuff is usually okay, right? But there are some companies that really make a difference, will need to make a difference there for critical tasks to involve two people, which is not possible with T-SQL today, right? There is no such thing built-in mechanism. Now, if you have ever heard of Purview, this is an external governance solution for Microsoft where we have the ability to create policies that allow a AAD, Entra ID identity to access your SQL Server. Right? So right now we have support for reading data and for reading metadata. That's the DevOps area. So by metadata, I mean basically all DMVs, DMFs, dynamic management functions, also dozens of DBCC statements, and even extended events. Basically anything you need for analyzing a system is covered under DevOps policies. Right? So the way that works is that you create a policy in Purview, based on these Entra ID accounts on Purview. And this policy can now apply to not just an individual database, but a whole set of servers within a resource group or just a whole subscription, right? Classic example would be you have your monitoring tool that you, of course, want to monitor all your SQL servers using the same account probably, right? And you would want it to just work, right? Ideally, even every new SQL server that comes along, right? Every so often as a new SQL server, wouldn't it be great if it just works from day one, from hour one, that the monitoring can connect without you having to be involved? Oh yeah, let me create a new login here on this new server, grant the right permissions for the monitoring solution to make that work, right? So, and with these policies, that does work, because these policies, once they are basically published at a resource group level or whole subscription, every individual SQL server who's part of that hierarchy in the resource group is pulling down these policies regularly and then understands, hey, here's the policy for performance monitoring, which includes my perfmon tool login, and says, yeah, you have access to the system metadata, right? It takes about maximum 5 minutes until the newest policy has been downloaded, but you could enforce it to be faster if it's necessary, right? So that works for anything that is an Azure resource, right? We can't do it on-prem, right? But we can do it on-prem if it's Azure on Arc, SQL Server on Arc, right? So SQL Server on Arc 2022 is supported, managed instance, and Azure SQL database, of course, right? So if you have all of these surfacing in your resource group and your policy works against that one, which account is mentioned in that policy will be recognized by SQL Server with the proper permission coming from that policy. All right. Yeah, so that unfortunately I cannot show at all here. So especially as a special portal in Purview where you would create it using UI even, where you just pick the policy name, it's called DevOps policy. Actually, no, it's under DevOps policies, and there we have a performance monitor role and a security auditor who can look at security metadata. You cannot create logins, but you can see which logins exist, for example, right? Like all these security DMVs. So you assign a user to that policy, save it, and then a couple of minutes later it will be downloaded into a SQL Server. And you do not need to create a login, right? So my demo would be basically a new account here in Entra ID, has never connected to a SQL Server. I create the policy with that name of that account and try to connect to any SQL Server within that resource group, and it will work as soon as the policy has been downloaded, all right? So that works because the policy is parsed by SQL Server, and the policy tells them who and what, on what level. Right? Level could be the whole server or the whole data or an individual database. Right? So it understands that that person, of course, can connect and run DMVs. Right? That's how that basically works. Let's see, there's one more slide in that one. Nope. Yeah. So we do not need a SQL login or SQL user, right? These are external users just basically coming from cache, right? The policy lives in cache. And because of that entry, SQL Server will accept the connection from that user. Yeah. So for example, if I'm a valid Entra ID account, as long as I exist in that policy, I can connect and run these policy-enabled statements. Now, however, there are obviously some limitations. As I just said, it's just DevOps policies for metadata and reading tables, right? So if you need further support, like you want that tool to also actually do index defragmentation, right? That's not read-only anymore. You would actually need T-SQL, right? And at that moment, you would need to create a login and user and so on, right? So that's as far as we are so far. And this leads me to the last topic, sort of. If that makes sense to you, what I just explained, when would it be useful enough for you to adopt that system? What do you think is most important after system metadata and reading data? So for example, I put something here. We don't have insert, update, delete on user data, right? Not yet. We don't have any DDL, like creating objects. It's not supported with policies. No, you would still need T-SQL, right? Store procedures, functions, and views are also not supported yet. The whole MSDB, like with all these jobs and backup tables, etc., are not yet included in that metadata that you can access, right? So, I mean, it's a huge system, and for every individual access check, we need to create a new external permission. It's really a thing that's in code, right? So for example, these about 800 DMVs that exist today, 2 years ago, they only had one permission check that was view server state, right? And we changed that. We made an OR check. Or you have either view server performance state, or you have the external policy action, which has a certain name, is a bit longer, right? Either one. You have the external or the internal. So for all of these 800 objects, we had to change the permission check, right? You can smell that was a lot of work, and this is why it's not like, oh, you just turn it on and it works for everything. No. I mean, we have a new permission name, so it needs to be inserted into the code in the right spot, right? So that's how it works, and that's why we need to prioritize, right? So yeah, if you have any feedback around that, what you think is critical, I'm here to hear that. All right, questions? We are on time in theory. So. Yep. All right, now I showed some a little bit more fancy solutions, maybe, especially the certificate-based authorization. Just remember, don't use technology just because it exists, right? I mean, try to keep it simple. This is really important, especially in security, right? If you make it too complicated, you will not be able to understand it. You lock yourself out. You can't understand an attack going on, etc., right? So, all right. Yeah, is there a question or no? Okay. If there's no question, then I'm done. Yeah. Thank you for having the patience in the beginning and to the whole end. Thanks, guys.